Good morning, Luang Por.
Good morning, Ajahn Sumedho.
Thank you for being available to offer some more Dhamma reflections and answer a few questions. So today is Monday the 5th of April 2021. So someone approached me and asked if you would talk about the challenges and the rewards of looking after other people. Specifically, the question came from a junior monk who is looking after a more senior monk, not an elderly person, just someone senior, and was wondering if you could share your experiences around that and what advice you can offer.
Yes, well, it's a good question, because in monastic life, in this Theravadan Vinaya tradition, you've got this agreed form called, they call it Vinaya, about action and speech. And it's about duties that we perform from junior to senior, from senior to junior. So it's not just one way kind of performance, but it's clearly designated. So, I found that very helpful, because being an American, I was brought up with this strong individualistic approach where, you assert yourself. Self-assertion is what you're encouraged to develop, rather than the sense of duty or obligation to parents or to teachers. I was never brought up with that influence. It was always about human rights, myself, my self-importance. And when I became a monk in Thailand and went to stay with Luang Por in Ubon, it became apparent how, when you're living in the Sangha of other monks, for like helping Luang Por, caring for Luang Por was always a delight, because you projected onto the senior monk, especially somebody as wise and charismatic as Ajahn Chah was, that you feel honored to kind of be able to help them in any way they need help, and perform your duties as a junior monk. It was no problem. But following several years later, I went to stay at a branch monastery with a senior monk who I didn't respect personally. And so I kept comparing him to Ajahn Chah, and then I could see my own personal reactions, like he's not worthy of my respect, and the kind of arrogance that I could become aware of through observing how I related to this senior monk that I personally looked down on and didn't approve of. And then the Vinaya, I helped clarify that through studying the Vinaya, the discipline, about duties of a junior monk to senior monk. It's nothing about whether you like them or agree with them, but it's clearly laid out the duties that a junior, newly ordained monk has toward the preceptor, towards the acharya, towards the teacher, towards the abbot of the monastery. And suddenly I began to see my own conceit and kind of arrogance, thinking that they have to be like Luang Por for me to serve them properly. And I thought, that's really conceited, and I began to look at myself as someone who made that kind of judgment and believed it, and I didn't want to be like that. I didn't want to be arrogant and conceited. So I used the Vinaya as a way to the traditional form that laid down by the Buddha and the disciples of the Buddha thousands of years ago, and referred to that about duty, which has nothing to do with one's personal feelings about the senior monks or junior monks. So it's a way of watching yourself, how, to listen to yourself, even to your self-conceit, your own critical mind about what you think this monk is like and whether you respect him or don't respect him, or he's too fussy or too difficult or talks too much or doesn't pay much attention. All these are opportunities to observe these kind of habitual self-reactions to experience. And in this way I found the Vinaya very helpful, because it you realized that even if the senior monk was not worthy of respect in any way, according to Vinaya, you still showed that respect in the proper way and helped in the dutiful ways that junior monks should. And I found a great joy in that, kind of relief that my life as a monk wasn't based on personal liking or disliking, approving or disapproving, but on a structure that I inherited through being ordained as a bhikkhu, as a fully ordained Buddhist monk, that I could use to reference experience with, to get to the roots of a lot of unrecognized arrogance and conceit that I didn't recognize when I was serving Luang Por Cha. Those kind of thoughts never occurred to me. So I encourage junior monks, senior monks to it's not a game we're playing in which we assume these roles and we have to play a game with each other, or we just have to blindly submit to discipline and seniority or our position in Sangha, but it's a way of referring to the present moment, to see the sakyaditi, the self-view, the ego that is latent and hidden sometimes in ordinary circumstances.
So in the balance, and just to maybe broaden the scope of this question, so we started off looking at it in terms of junior monks helping to look after senior monks and the reciprocal duties, but you find this kind of dynamic as well in lay life, in any aspect of life, like between parents and children, between when the children are young, and there's maybe a sense of what we're owed or how people ought to behave, how my parents should be or how my children should be. But then also later in life, looking after elderly parents who start needing care. And we come up against these duties, one could call them, that one can perform to assist each other. And yet we've got all these human sides, human flaws, if we could call them that way, that are part of the picture too. So in the balance, what would you say is the reward? Like on one side, looking after Ajahn Chah is very rewarding because he was such a charismatic person. Looking after an incredibly sweet-natured mother can be very rewarding. But then it seems like you're talking about some other sense of satisfaction that you derive from taking on these challenges of looking at what arises in one's own heart when one is looking after someone that may be difficult to look after. How do you recognize the challenges, and how do you make it satisfying to address those challenges?
Well, the same theory applies to lay life, because parents are our seniors, and you start, even people have all kinds of reactions to the suggestion of duties to parents. Duties are not highly regarded in modern life, in the modern world, materialistic worldview. But, just out of compassion and generosity, these are qualities to develop, and, to do the best one can, and with those who are developing awareness with their daily lives, it's important to recognize the resentment you might feel having to look after a difficult parent. It's like this, you're not trying to perform duties just blindly out of some kind of blind sense of having to do it and kind of grit your teeth, grin and bear it attitude, but the opportunities to see hidden resentments, aversion that one might feel, or memories that might arise, we feel not loved or not properly taken care of by our parents. These are mental states that can arise when we feel we have a lot of love with our parents. It's much more easy to look after them. But difficult people are also, you learn really a lot from that, having to watch your own resentment, the feeling of these people endlessly demand or fussy about everything and you don't like it. And you can observe that, when you try to suppress those feelings, then you experience what they call burnout. Care is burning out because they're trying to be stiff upper lip and carry on performing their duties, and at the same time feeling a lot of bitterness, resentment, anger, and then they try to suppress it, or they let it out on getting drunk or drugs, one way of releasing psychological traumas. But mindfulness is a skillful way to deal with it. Because we all in life have to, live in society, Monastics, even though we leave the society in terms of not participating as laymen, we're very much connected to the societies for the four requisites for food, for example, or for robes and shelter, medicine. And then we also feel a sense of gratitude when we think of our parents nurtured us, took care of us when we were helpless infants. Mother gave us birth, and she had to change our nappies and feed us and guide us, through childhood. And so we start, seeing that in one's old age, one needs to be taken care of, almost like an infant, because you don't have that. The older you get, the less you're capable of taking care of yourself. And I found as a monk, in Thailand, it was very easy because the Thai society is based on this respect for elders. So even when I was 60, when I was still, quite healthy and vigorous, junior monks would want to help me down the steps, and they started calling me Luang Por, which means noble father. And I could see the ego not wanting to be considered somebody's father, or not wanting some monk's help to go down steps. Like you could hear your mind saying, I can do this, I don't need you. And it's kind of the arrogance of youth and middle age, and the desire not to surrender to the realities of age that take place quite naturally. Now when people call me Luang Por, it's like something I revere. It's a beautiful thing to be called. I'm not thinking, Ajahn Sumedho, and I'm not older at 86, 87. I'm in the great-grandfather category now. So, sit back and enjoy life, and learn from it as best you can under the particular situations you find yourself in.
So earlier you were mentioning how you found joy in overcoming that challenge? Like, because that's not what people immediately think of when they're looking after either a junior monk looking after some more difficult senior monk, or someone looking after a grumpy, curmudgeonly old parent. These resentments that you talk about that we need to allow into consciousness, how do you go from experiencing resentment to experiencing joy?
Well, joy is a natural state of conscious awareness. When you let go of your own sense of separate self, the ego, my rights and my views and my opinions, when you see through that, then what's left, what remains is a sense of joy of being. It's natural. It's not a created state that you kind of, try to generate. It happens when you give up, when you let go of life, when, duties are performed accordingly to time and place, and then you can find great joy in performing them, because that's what we do. That's the way we function as a society, as a sangha of monks, or as a society of lay people. And we're not asking senior monks to be arahants or wise and compassionate. If we are, then we're making demands on somebody else, and we're judging them according to our own views, which we can see is conceit. It's ditthimana. It's a sense of, I know what's right and they don't have it right, they've got it wrong. The same with parents, taking care of one's elderly parents is something to rejoice in. But you can't make yourself just rejoice because I advise you to do so, but by observing what happens. So you're not burning out with resentment, suppressed feelings and anger and resentment. You're accessing that, you're observing that, you're the witness to conceit, to self-conceit, self-views, clinging to opinions, and carrying resentments from the past into the present, and you're developing wisdom. Wisdom's guiding you rather than just a blind sense of duty and compulsion of having to do things because you feel you have to. It's got much more a sense of freedom and honor involved than in just performing one's duties, grin and bear it style.
So there's a sense of not just doing it for the other person, but doing it for oneself in a way.
Yes. Works both ways. You find that you really appreciate, like being old, you really appreciate the consideration you get from younger people. Because in modern society, materialistic Western society, old people tend to be ignored. People don't want to talk to an old man or an old woman. And one time I was, when Tanjau Kunpanyananda was visiting England, we were taking him up north to our branch monastery in Northumberland in Harlem. And he wanted to stop in the city of York, which has a famous cathedral, York Minster. So we arrived early in the evening in York. We went to the York Minster, and Tanjau Kunpanyananda, we walked with him into the cathedral, which is very beautiful, impressive bit of architecture, So, I was very glad to go there because I really loved that building. And Tanjau Kunpanyananda would go around, looking at the stained glass windows and the icons and so forth, admiring the architecture, and then you see an old person and go up to them and greet them in his kind of strange English, and they'd all respond with great happiness that somebody'd pay attention to them. So I saw a couple of old women sitting on a bench inside the basilica, and so I went over to them and said, "Good evening, how are you?" And they said, "Oh, you've made our day, you've spoken to us," and I felt so sorry for them, that they just look like very nice old people sitting in church, where ordinarily they just expect to be ignored and overlooked. And how just a simple greeting like, "How are you?" can make their day. I was quite moving, quite impressed with that.
That was very beautiful. But I remember one story you told me that just in this, in terms of doing things because they're good and because we feel happy doing them, even though the person towards whom we perform certain gestures or duties may, in all appearances, not seem worthy, so to say. You told me once the story of this woman who would, a Sri Lankan woman, I think, or Thai woman, who would pay respects to her husband every observance day. And a husband who otherwise wasn't necessarily very faithful to her or didn't treat her very nicely.
Yes, that was a story I read in a Thai magazine years ago, and it impressed me because in Thai culture, the old Buddhist culture in Thailand, the duties to wife to husband, husband to wife are clearly laid out. And a proper Thai woman, brought up in the traditional style, knows her duties and performs them. And this particular story was about a Thai woman whose husband was not very respectable and didn't treat her properly, had other women on the side, and his wife would every fortnight go and bow to him and ask for forgiveness, perform her duty to her husband. And I told this story to a group of Western people, and they were indignant. They thought that was terrible, that he should bow to her and she should bow to him. And so these are the kind of thoughts that are important to observe in ourselves, because, in my own personal judgmental conditioning, I would have agreed, she was worthy of respect and he should bow to her and ask for forgiveness. That's how it should be according to an ideal. But, I couldn't help but admire a woman who performed her duties with, a sense of integrity, not a sense of, just bowing down because of it's what you're supposed to do or because her husband expected it, but because she found great joy in doing what was right, considered right in her relationship to a husband that she probably didn't respect in terms of personal feelings. And so this is just a way of reflecting that, how personal relationships can be. And, in marital, nowadays it's about partnerships rather than husband and wife. And, the whole relationship has changed from duties to equality. You do this and I do that, and we share everything according to what's fair and just and equal is very idealistic, and it has its own, as an ideal, it's very beautiful. But as the reality of here and now in relationships from one individual human being to another, to get along, to learn to live with people, whether they're easy to live with or difficult, you learn what's important is to develop wisdom in regard to it, rather than just, become burnt out, negative and resentful without understanding what's happening to yourself.
So in these various relationships and acts of kindness or help that we perform towards each other, rather than coming from a place of being happy because I'm doing it for someone I'm inspired by, I mean, that may be the case, but to come back to doing it because it's good and right, and learning how to derive happiness from that, which kind of gives you then freedom from whether they are inspiring or not, whether it's a husband or wife, a teacher, a parent, a child. Would you say that's
right?
correct?
It's, you're not demanding somebody else be ideal for you. That's conceit, isn't it? If I say, I want you to be like me and do everything I think you should do, that is, that's arrogance and conceit. And, living in a sangha of monks and nuns, you find, each individual's different from the other. And I used to judge them by my own standards of what I held as right and good. And then those that didn't fit into what I thought was something wrong with them. And in the early days, I tried to adjust them to make them fit into my ideal monk or nun, and it didn't work. It was getting me nowhere except a lot of resentment and anger from them and frustration with myself. And then, I realized, just using Ajahn Chah as a kind of role model, the way he took on in his Sangha some very difficult individuals, and both in the nun section and in the monks. And he wasn't expecting them to conform to his ideal of what should be, but he was encouraging them to be themselves, to observe the way you are. Like me, when I was the first Western monk with Luang Por Sumedho, he had enough, he had the intuition to accept me as I am, which I felt a great sense of freedom, because I never felt that with any other, with my parents or with any other person, somebody just accepting me as I am. Where with Luang Por Sumedho, I always felt, and he could, even though he'd never traveled abroad or he was not highly sophisticated or educated, he understood human nature, and he advised me how to work with the way I am, with my frustration at learning to speak Thai and fitting into a totally different environment, way of life, into monastic form, which was, jumping into the deep end of the pool and floundering about. I didn't know how to swim yet, but you had to survive. And he really, tuned into that. So a lot of the things I did, kind of stupid reactions to my experience in the first year that I spent with Luang Por Sumedho, he more or less overlooked, where he wouldn't have with Thai monks. I don't think he would have, because the relationship was different. Their sense of themselves, their duties, their whole structure, moral structure was based on Buddhist precepts and Vinaya. So that was, that was taken for granted. But with the Westerner, first Westerner, who never studied Vinaya or, had a lot of faith in Buddha Dhamma, I felt such admiration for the kind of humor and way he led me to reflect on my own reactions. He wasn't telling me how I should feel about things, that I should respect the senior monks, or that I should be selfless and give. He wasn't giving me all the advice that I was expecting, but encouraged me to observe what I was actually feeling, the kind of resentment or frustration that was quite common in the first year when you don't know what's happening most of the time.
So now that you've brought up these experiences in the old days with Luang Por in the context of our previous topic here, if I may just switch over to that, but after that first year, when you did start getting used to the new forms, how did that change? Did he start, when he saw that you were adapting and starting to find your grounding there, did he start treating you a little tougher sometimes?
Well, I developed such a kind of trust during that first year that I was prepared for whatever he was going to, I trusted it, that even if he scolded me or insulted me, that I would, I'd see that as something to look at, my own embarrassment or resentment. I knew how to use my conditioning, how to observe it. And the way Luang Por taught meditation, I could observe myself, my reactions to things, my conceit, my American conditioning. Because in Americans you have very different social conditioning. I was brought up as a strict Christian, so I had, my early conditioning experience with life was based on Christianity and American, white middle-class American values, so that's the program that I went to stay with Luang Por with. That program, that's all I knew, that's what I identified with. And then, going into a Thai Buddhist monastery in a remote part of Thailand, I was brought up in a kind of middle-class city life. I wasn't a country boy, so, you're brought up with things you just take for granted. But in Wat Pah Pong, life was very basic. The first kuti, the first meditation hut that was given to me was too low. The ceiling was too low. I kept banging my head on the beams. And the door frames on all the kutis, on all the chalets were all low for Thai monks who are not very tall. And fortunately it had, the kuti had a tin roof, which was a luxury in those days. Having a tin roof was safe from the rain and so forth. So, but it made a lot of noise when it rained too. So in sleeping on a brass mat on a bare wooden floor. I'd never done that as a lay person in America. So I learned to adjust to, and it wasn't, I quite enjoyed it because I found out, a lot of things that I thought absolutely necessary were unnecessary. So we didn't have electricity, or we had to draw water from a well in a bucket, and life was very, on a very basic, primitive survival level. But to me, it was inspiring because I learned I could do that I wasn't habituated to a high standard of life that I had to have with me all the time. I could adapt. I found myself quite adaptable to different situations. So it's important to realize that monastic life can be based on ideals, what a perfect monk is, perfectly mindful, compassionate, filled with metta, and always developing meditation and developing the path. I mean, so you have monastic ideals, ideals of perfection for the form of the bhikkhu, the traditional Theravada bhikkhu, which I found inspiring. The whole bhikkhu ambience was very inspiring, especially the Tudanga style, the forest tradition that Luang Por lived with. I found that very inspiring. The ideal Dutanga bhikkhu, alms mendicant. So I felt inspired to live that way, which brought me to the desire to stay with Luang Por. He would send me off to branch monasteries that I didn't want to go to, but I did anyway. I'd go where he assigned me and observe my own resentment or not wanting to go, began to feel free from it, from just getting things done. When Luang Por said, you go to this branch monastery, I just go. And if I resented it, I could be aware of that.
So that's where the previous questions and this one kind of come together, is like the freedom that you discover in this adaptability is the same, gives you the same joy as the freedom you discover in being able to do the right thing and looking after someone, even though you might not be inspired.
Yes, you find your true nature.
That freedom.
Underlying all the grasping, clutching at conditions, all the ignorance that we are conditioned with, underlying that is happiness or joy. The natural state of non-attachment, which is a relaxed presence here and now of total relaxation, trust, and openness is a reality of joy, which is always here and now. It's not, I cultivate joy as some kind of practice. It just happens from releasing myself from the bondage of my ego, my views and opinions, my cultural, social conditioning, my fears and self-consciousness and whatever form it takes, just being released from grasping those conditions and reinforcing them to just trusting in the open awareness of the present is liberation, freedom.
A final question. Someone was asking what it was that sustained you through the difficulty of that early year or the early couple of years in Thailand. Would you say it was that joy from this liberation?
Joy, and I just loved the life, really. It was, I couldn't think of a better way to live my life. I was 31 years old when I ordained, so I lived long enough, experienced enough, to realize the kind of emptiness of my life. It had no meaning, no purpose. And as I turned 30, I began to really wonder what's the point of living? Because when I was 20, I had a kind of goal to reach and a kind of ideal to look toward. By the time I was 30, that idealism had collapsed and disappointed, and thought, by the time I was 30, I would be this kind of marvelous individual, but I wasn't. I was a kind of depressed, miserable, unhappy man. And I thought, on my 30th birthday, I thought, am I going to have to live 30 more years with these mental states, with these same boring thoughts, these same reactions to experience? Is that what I have to look forward to, is just 30 more years of this? And, that was what inspired me to investigate Buddhist monasticism. Being in Sabah at the time, in North Borneo, I was very close to, a good holiday destination was Thailand, a thoroughly Buddhist country. And I was impressed, I'd never been in a real Buddhist country before, where the king and 95% of the population were Theravada Buddhists. So I thought, and it had never been a colony of a European country or any other nation, so it was quite unique. And so I found it, a kind of mysteriously fascinating country to live in. And it's a very welcoming country. So when I showed an interest in Buddhism, doors opened wide for me in Bangkok before I ordained. Because I was just, I was teaching English at a university in Bangkok, and I mixed with other expatriate Buddhists. But when I decided to become a monk, then the Thai Buddhists, they opened their doors wide more than everyone wanted to help me, So I always kind of felt this gratitude towards Thai people in general because, I thought the whole nation, millions of people want me to become a monk, want me to become enlightened. That's more than my parents want. So, over the years, in my early life in Thailand, you felt this incredible sense of gratitude where you were fed very well every day and given a lot of respect from the lay people and encouragement, endless encouragement to meditate.
Thank you very much, Luang Por.
My pleasure.